Welcome to Para and Story Level Introduction for Teaching at the Right Level in Namibia. So let's begin. Looking at our objectives or our steps of developing literacy. And so we're now at the point where we're going from children who can read paras or stories and getting them up to comprehension and writing. And as you can see, there's no end here. There's no ending level because it just gets more and more complicated in terms of the stories, the length of those stories, the difficulty of those stories, and the writing, the length of that writing, the difficulty of the vocabulary within that writing. So there's no end, right? It's just continuing to increase the level of the learners. You might notice that there's no real difference between paras and stories. There's nothing actually in between these two different levels. And that's because there isn't really a difference between reading paras and stories, other than the children don't have enough vocabulary or fluency to be able to read them. So you might remember that we do have objectives. We have a spelling word list, we have rhymes, we have synonyms and antonyms or opposites. But all of those are actually just activities to build fluency and expand the children's vocabulary as they practice speaking and writing in English on their own so that they're able to read longer and longer text to go from paragraphs, simple paragraphs, to stories. So you can see that here, they start off with difficulty with vocabulary and complex sentences for why they're not at story level, why they're at this entry point. And you want to end with recognizing more words and being able to read simple stories. So when it says here more words, which words are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the words in the word list for the sound spellings. We're talking about the words that they come up with when they make rhymes. And we're also talking about the words that they come up with when they do synonyms and antonyms. So those become your word bank, right? That you want to make sure the children can read all those words that come up within your paragraph lessons at the exit point. And lastly, you want to make sure that they're able to read simple stories. So don't get distracted by rhymes and synonyms and antonyms. We want to make sure that they're not leaving the paragraph level until they're able to read simple stories. So this level has a ton of reading. Things that you should not do. What you shouldn't do when you're teaching the vocabulary building activities of rhymes and synonyms and antonyms is just to list it for the students on the board and have them memorize it. That's what we want to not do. What do we want to do instead? Well, we want to encourage the children to volunteer or come up with the words on their own and to build this chart. So they make the long list of words to memorize and test them on at the end of the exit point, right? Not words from you, right? Because you want them to be able to read at the right level, which is their level, right? The words that they know already and are familiar with. So now we'll talk about how we go from stories into being able to write. So in the TaRL assessment, we have no idea what the writing skills of the children are. The assessment for teaching at the right level ends at comprehension questions. And so if students get the comprehension questions right, then they have comprehension and you're able to tick that box and go straight into writing. If they didn't get those correct, answering those questions at the end of the leveling assessment correct, then you want to focus on building those comprehension skills, giving them lots and lots of questions to answer about stories, both verbally and written. A lot of the stories and comprehension level are going to be verbal, right? It's going to be an oral activity because you don't want to test writing yet. You want to wait and make sure they can actually read with meaning and understanding, and then move on to writing. So here, within the story level, we're going to be, they're already at story level, right? So you're just trying to improve upon their comprehension, their writing, and then lastly, their spelling. So you go through tenses and plurals. This will help them to write better. It'll also help them to understand what they read if they really know what do tenses mean and what do plurals mean. They're also understanding the story parts, the beginning, middle, and end of a story. This helps them, again, to understand their stories better and also to be able to write their own stories. And then lastly, the sound spelling chart will help them to spell words correctly, right? Because they'll know the different spellings for the different sounds, and they'll know the patterns that come up, right? That AY is usually at the end of a word, AI is at the middle of a word, right? And they'll start to see, oh, wow, I don't have to use the wrong spellings, right? That might have the same phonetic sound. And then lastly, your exit point is really going to be answering questions based on the story, making sure they can comprehend, read with meaning, and write their own stories. So reading with meaning, what do we mean by that? It means that if the children read a story, they're able to retell it back to you, and they're also able to understand specific key words within the story. And you want to make sure that they build up to be able to write and read stories well by ensuring that they're using the tenses and the plurals in full sentences. Again, starting with doing it verbally. I cooked food, I cooked food. She is happy, she was happy. They come up with their own as well. And you want to verbally be able to write, to come up with the right sentences in the right tenses. Same with plurals. In reading, you want to go from paras to longer and longer stories using your storybooks. And you want to be constantly discussing the meaning and the comprehension questions within those stories, and really discuss, not just ask them the question. At this level, you want to be digging into the meaning of it. And again, reading, practicing, rereading, reading the same story multiple times. And let's think about how we make reading really fun and engaging for the learners. You don't want it to be a kind of bland exercise, right? Are they reading with the right tone? If there's an exclamation point, are they raising their voice? If it's something that someone's quoted saying something within the story, have you talked to them about that? What do those little quotation marks mean, right? You're allowing them to understand the text more and more and making it very fun and engaging. Lastly, with writing, you want to make sure they use the spelling chart to come up with words and to check their words, right? And you also want to encourage them to use the words on the word list within their own writing and within their own stories. So let's do an example. Let's say we have now Millie's class. She has 20 para-level children at the beginning of the program and 10 story-level children. So they already know how to read the stories, and they got the comprehension questions correct, those 10 story-level children. And the para-level children, they failed to read the story, right, fluently. So how should she plan her lesson? How should Millie plan her first 10 days? And let's start with maybe the first 5 days, right? So as you're thinking about the first 5 to 10 days of a TaRL program, you want to keep these same principles in mind for all levels, not just for the story and paragraph level. Number one, you're teaching one thing per day, right? You're not teaching tenses and plurals and this and that. You're teaching one thing per day. Just like when we do in numeracy, we only teach addition, right? We're not teaching addition, subtraction, multiplication. We're not mixing different things, right? If we're talking today about synonyms, we're talking about synonyms, right? And antonyms, nothing else, right? Number two, you want to go from simple to complex using those checkpoints to target your instruction. So if you notice that, wow, my children really struggle at speaking and being able to say full sentences and speak in full sentences, that's what you should focus on. That's a wonderful objective, right? And that would be something that your checkpoints would allow you to see as well. Number three, repeat activities. I see a lot of time, we want to do word building, and one day, then the next day it's going to be the basket game, then the next day it's going to be a totally different activity. You want to repeat the activities so that learners know the procedure, know it even better than you, right? That they could lead the activity on their own. And that really builds their confidence, because then they're no longer thinking about the procedure, they're thinking about the words, right? They're being more and more creative. So for example, the first time you do a mind map, you're kind of like, what? I don't know how to do this mind map. But once you do the mind map 3, 4 times, then you're able, right, to be more and more creative about it. I know it might be boring for the facilitators, but for children, especially young children, they really enjoy repetition, actually. And one other note is just the common activities are for all levels, even though they are broken down into recognition, letter recognition, and decoding and fluency, it doesn't mean that you can only use fluency activities for your story level children. It just means that those are the main activities that you want them to master. But you should mix in word chain. You should mix in, right, other things and tailor other common activities to the level of the learner. So if you're doing the basket game with paragraph and story level learners, you don't want to put a 3-letter word cat, right, for them to do the basket game. You want to put a hard word in there. You might put session, right? You might put, something a little bit more difficult that would be a challenge for the learners to be able to read. And especially their vocabulary list, right? Words that you have come up with that they struggle with, that's what you should put in the basket game, right? To review. Number 4, read the charts daily, even as it gets into the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th day. Continue to read those charts. It's a review. Not every single child has passed the checkpoint. We have a 70% pass rate before they go on to the next thing. The goal is not to go through the charts very quickly. That is not the goal. The goal is to build the learner's skills using the charts as a support and as a review. So the more you go over the same charts, the better, actually. Don't rush. Children are absent one day. Children, some of the children didn't pass that checkpoint. It's a really wonderful review tool that you can use to build and review into your lessons. And lastly, number 5, really focus on those reading skills. Like I said, it's not about how fast you can cover all the content or go through all the charts, all through all the charts. The most important thing is the exit point. Look at that exit point. What does it say? Does it say they could read all the charts? No, it says they need to be able to read. And what level have you now brought them to? If you're moving your beginning and letter level children up to word objectives, then they need to be able to already read words, right? Because at word level, you're really focusing on more complex words and building them up to paragraphs and stories. So here's an example of Millie's class where we're applying those 5 principles, right? We're going to introduce the sound spelling word list. We're going to assess what spellings and words do the children struggle with, introduce this concept of alternative spellings, which you'll see there, that there are a lot of alternative spellings within the words that are on that spelling word list. You're going to focus on in the next lesson any challenging words or spellings that came up from the first lesson that you identified from your checkpoint. Then you might introduce the rhymes, assess if children are able to identify the beginning and ending sounds in English, right? Sometimes children can read, but they still have very weak ability to hear the sounds in words. So can they rhyme, right? If they can rhyme, great. You move on to the next thing. Maybe you introduce synonyms and antonyms, and you start making a beautiful chart of synonyms and antonyms. Perhaps they're familiar with these terms already, and so it's not a new concept to them. And so by the end of the week, you're able to just use those words that you came up with the word list, use the words from the rhyming lesson and the words from that last synonym and antonym lesson to checkpoint the learners, right, on all this vocabulary. Can they read all of those words, right? And practice doing them within the different TaRL activities. Put all those words in the basket game again. And so if they're good on that, then you would move on, right? You move on to now sentences. So we're out of the word level and we're into sentences, right? We're making full sentences using the different tenses. Again, this assessment is at first very oral, verbally, right? And then only later do you move to doing those same things in written form, right? Then you introduce plurals, right? Again, assessing it verbally. Then you introduce the 3 parts of a story. You're the one writing the story on the board. They're just telling you the story. You're focusing on that good story structure of beginning, middle, and end. And then you exit point, right? You have them read simple stories and answer questions about those stories and see, can they read with meaning? And hopefully throughout all of these lessons, when you're having the time for reading, that time is a lot longer for paragraph and story level children, because that's really, right, the focus, right? They're able to read already, so you can read a lot more text, and you want to spend a lot more time discussing and answering questions throughout all of these lessons, even as you go through the charts and introduce synonyms and antonyms and different things. And then lastly, you introduce writing, right? And with writing, again, you go right back to the beginning here. So when you think about story level, You're repeating all these things only with an emphasis on writing, right? So now we're doing the spelling word list, and I actually do want you to spell all those words correctly. Now we're doing rhymes, and I want you to write the rhymes instead of me. Now we're doing synonyms and antonyms. You have to be able to write these. And then the same is true for tenses, plurals, and finally stories. And then those stories just get longer and longer and longer and better, hopefully with better vocabulary. So again, what's so big about this 10 lessons? Why do I want to focus on these 10 lessons? Because by the time you get to the 10th lesson, that's your new midpoint regrouping time, right? I want all of the volunteers to come together, look at the checkpoint data, look at your learners' work, and see what groups they should be in and regroup them if it is appropriate based on what they have learned so far. So if some children have progressed on to story, you might break them out and make a new story group. And if some children are progressing less quickly, you might keep them at para and do the para objectives again with new children who've come up from word level and now have joined the para. So you might change which groups the children are in. You might change the facilitators. You might learn about yourself as a facilitator and say, hey, I think I'm better at, the story level or the word level or whatever. It's an opportunity to regroup. So again, what about the story level children? Want to make sure you're moving on to writing, you're doing longer and longer stories, focusing on meaning and comprehension. So that's it. The last activity now is for you to read any one paragraph and one story from the storybook, just select it on your own. Read that one para and that one story. And then I want you to select 2 words from each of the texts that you want to decode. You want to practice decoding as if you were teaching this to a para and story level class, right? So choose difficult words. And then you want to choose 3 vocabulary words from each of the texts to teach as well. So think about, which words might be unfamiliar for a class. What's the meaning of this story? How can I choose words that will help the children understand the meaning of the story better? And how do I make this fun, right? What questions could I ask that would make it kind of fun? And as you'll see from the meat pie story and different stories in the storybooks, they're written intentionally to be fun. So lean into that and use that to your advantage.